I never imagined a quiet classroom would become the place where my life started slipping out of control. From the outside, everything about me looked stable. I had a long relationship that most people called perfect. We had been together for years, long enough for routines to replace excitement and polite conversations to replace real connection. Nothing dramatic had happened between us. No huge fights. No explosive arguments. Just a slow, quiet distance that grew so gradually I didn't even notice it until silence became the loudest thing in our home. Every morning followed the same pattern. Wake up, exchange a few automatic words, drink coffee across from someone who barely looked up from their phone, then leave for the day. It felt less like living with a partner and more like sharing space with a polite stranger. I told myself this was normal. People said relationships settle down after a while. Passion fades, comfort replaces it. I repeated those explanations like a mantra because admitting something was missing felt far more dangerous than my days at the college were predictable too. I spent most of my time in the same building, walking the same hallways, entering the same classrooms. The environment should have been lively, full of energy and curiosity, but for me it had become mechanical. Teach, answer questions, organize materials, repeat. Students came and went every semester, but my life stayed exactly the same. Then one week everything shifted in a way I never expected. A new instructor joined the department. At first I barely noticed him. People come and go all the time in academic environments, and introductions during staff meetings are usually forgettable. But there was something different about the way he carried himself. He wasn't loud or overly confident. In fact, he seemed calm, observant, almost quiet. While everyone else talked over each other, he listened. Our first real conversation happened by accident. I was organizing papers in one of the empty classrooms when he stepped in, looking slightly lost. He asked if the room was free for the next hour. His voice was steady and relaxed, the kind of voice that made people naturally pause and pay attention. We ended up talking longer than either of us expected. Nothing dramatic, just small conversation about schedules, classes, and the confusing layout of the building. But when he laughed at something I said, it caught me off guard. Not because the joke was good, but because it had been a while since someone reacted to me like that. Like they were genuinely interested. After that day we started crossing paths more often. At first it was quick greetings in the hallway. Then it turned into short conversations between classes. He asked questions most people never bothered with. How long I had been teaching. What subjects I actually enjoyed. Whether I ever felt burned out. The strange part was how easy it felt to answer him. Normally I kept my personal thoughts locked away, especially at work. But with him, the words came out naturally. Maybe it was because he listened without interrupting. Maybe it was because his attention felt sincere instead of polite. Little by little those conversations became the most interesting part of my day. I started noticing details I shouldn't have paid attention to. The way his eyes focused completely when someone spoke. The calm confidence in his posture. The way he remembered small things I mentioned days earlier. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. No flirting. No bold moves. Just quiet moments that lingered a little longer than they should have. One afternoon we both ended up staying late. Most of the building had emptied out, leaving the halls unusually quiet. I was finishing paperwork inside one of the classrooms when he walked in carrying a stack of books. He paused when he saw me, then smiled in that relaxed way I had started recognizing. We talked again, longer this time. The conversation drifted away from work and into more personal territory. He asked if I liked teaching or if I had simply gotten used to it. I admitted something I rarely said out loud. Sometimes I felt like my life had become predictable to the point of feeling unreal. He didn't laugh or brush it off. Instead, he understood that he shared small pieces of his own story too, how he had changed jobs more than once, how routine made him restless. The honesty between us created a strange kind of closeness that neither of us acknowledged directly. At some point I realized we were standing much closer than before. The room felt different. Quieter. Smaller. That I could hear faint sounds from the hallway outside, but inside the classroom the air felt heavy with something unspoken. Neither of us moved away. For a brief moment our conversation stopped completely. The silence should have been awkward, yet it wasn't. It felt charged, like something invisible had suddenly appeared between us. He looked at me in a way that made my thoughts scatter. Not aggressively, not boldly, just attentively. Like he was studying a question he hadn't decided how to ask. My heart started beating faster, which made no sense. Nothing had happened. We were simply standing there. Two co-workers talking in an empty classroom, but the feeling was undeniable. I stepped back slightly, suddenly aware of how close we had been. He seemed to notice the shift too. For a second neither of us spoke, then footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway outside. The sound snapped the moment apart. Instantly he cleared his throat and glanced toward the door while I quickly gathered the papers on the desk, pretending I had been focused on work the entire time. When the footsteps passed and the hallway grew quiet again, we both laughed awkwardly, the tension dissolving just enough to make the situation feel normal again. But something had already changed. As he left the classroom that evening, he paused at the door and looked back at me for a brief moment, not long enough to say anything, just long enough to make one thing clear. Whatever had almost happened in that empty classroom wasn't my imagination, and for the first time in years, the quiet routine of my life suddenly felt unpredictable. The next morning I told myself the moment in the classroom meant nothing. It was just two coworkers talking too long in an empty room, nothing more. But the truth was harder to ignore. My mind kept replaying the way we had stood there, the silence between us, the strange tension that had filled the space. I tried to focus on work like I always did, but concentration felt impossible. When I walked into the building that day, I caught myself scanning the hallway without thinking. I told myself I wasn't looking for him, but when I finally saw him at the end of the corridor, my heart reacted before my logic could stop it. He noticed me too. For a brief second we both hesitated, as if neither of us knew how the other would act after the night before. Then he simply greeted me like usual, calm and casual, asking how my morning had been. His voice sounded normal, but something in his eyes told me he remembered everything just as clearly as I did. That normal conversation should have ended the tension. Instead, it made things worse. The moment we pretended nothing had happened, the memory became louder inside my head. For the rest of the week we continued crossing paths. Sometimes it was quick greetings. Other times we stopped to talk for a few minutes. But every interaction carried a quiet awareness that hadn't existed before. It was subtle, but undeniable. We both felt it. I began noticing how easily our conversations drifted away from safe topics. What started as discussions about schedules slowly turned into deeper exchanges about life, relationships, and the strange feeling of being stuck in routines that no longer felt meaningful. One afternoon he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Are you happy?" It was such a simple question, yet I struggled to answer it. I could have said yes. It would have been the expected response. But something about the way he asked made honesty feel unavoidable. So I admitted the truth in the most careful way possible. I told him my life wasn't bad, just quiet, predictable, comfortable in a way that sometimes felt empty. He didn't judge me for saying that. If anything, he seemed to understand exactly what I meant. That understanding created something dangerous between us. It felt like we were the only two people in the building who could see past the polite surface everyone else accepted. Soon our conversations began lasting longer than they should have. Sometimes we stayed after most people had left the building. not intentionally at first. Work would simply stretch into the evening, and we would end up talking again while organizing materials or reviewing schedules. Each time it happened, the same quiet tension returned, the awareness of how easily the situation could cross a line that I tried to convince myself that nothing inappropriate was happening. We were just talking. Just sharing thoughts. But deep down I knew emotional closeness could be just as powerful as physical attraction, and I was starting to crave those conversations. Days without them felt strangely dull. Days when we talked felt lighter, almost exciting. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. One evening a heavy rainstorm rolled over the campus, forcing most people to rush home early. By the time my work was finished, the building had become almost completely silent. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed a familiar light still glowing from one of the classrooms that he was inside. For a moment I considered continuing past the door. That would have been the smarter choice. But instead I stepped inside and asked if he was still working. He smiled slightly and said he was just finishing up. The rain outside grew louder against the windows, creating a steady rhythm that made the empty building feel even more isolated. We started talking again, casually at first, but the conversation quickly drifted into deeper territory. He told me he admired how dedicated I was to my work. I laughed at that, saying dedication was just another word for being stuck in routine. Then he said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "You don't seem stuck," he said quietly. "You seem like someone who's been holding back." The comment caught me completely off guard. No one had ever described me like that before. Before I could respond, our eyes met in a way that felt different from every conversation we'd had before, closer, more personal. The silence between us stretched longer than usual. I felt my pulse quicken, aware of how little space separated us. Then he stepped closer, not aggressively, not suddenly. Just one small movement that made the tension impossible to ignore. My mind told me to step back. To create distance. To remember the life waiting for me outside that classroom, but instead I stayed exactly where I was. For a few seconds neither of us spoke, then he said my name quietly, as if asking permission without actually forming the question. That was the moment everything changed. I leaned forward before my thoughts could stop me. The kiss happened slowly at first, uncertain but undeniable. It felt like crossing a line that had been slowly approaching for weeks. The moment our hesitation disappeared, the tension that had built between us finally released. What followed was intense and reckless in a way I hadn't expected from myself. Months, maybe years of quiet loneliness suddenly turned into a rush of emotion that felt impossible to control. I remember whispering something without even thinking about the words. I begged him not to stop. For a brief moment the world outside that classroom disappeared completely. Then suddenly the sound of a door handle turning echoed from the hallway. Both of us froze instantly. Someone was trying to open the classroom door. Panic shot through my chest as reality crashed back in. We moved apart quickly, hearts racing, listening as the handle rattled once more before footsteps passed by the door and continued down the hallway. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. We had just come dangerously close to being caught, and yet the most frightening realization wasn't the risk we had taken. It was the fact that neither of us seemed ready to pretend it hadn't happened. After that night, I stopped trusting comfort. I started observing patterns. He changed his phone password 3 days later. Not casually. Not accidentally. Intentionally. I noticed because one evening he handed me his phone to check a delivery notification, then hesitated before unlocking it himself and placing it in my hand like a controlled object. The openness we once had was gone. Replaced by management. He started going to the gym more often. New shirts. Better cologne. Haircuts every 2 weeks instead of every 2 months. He claimed he wanted to feel confident again. I wondered when confidence became something that needed secrecy. He carried his phone everywhere. Kitchen. Balcony. Bathroom. Even quick trips to take out the trash. If a notification appeared, he angled the screen away. If I walked too close, the conversation ended. It wasn't dramatic. It was calculated. That I tested him once. Who's texting you this late? He didn't look up. Group chat. About what? Work stuff. At midnight, the lies weren't explosive. They were small and controlled. That's what made them dangerous. When I finally brought up the heart emoji, he didn't get defensive. He got offended. You don't trust me? He asked quietly, like I had wounded him. That I tried to explain it wasn't about trust. It was about transparency. But he turned it around so smoothly I almost apologized. You're creating problems in your head, he said. I can't even talk to people without you assuming something. People, not her. That I started questioning myself. Maybe I was insecure. Maybe 5 years had made me too dependent. Maybe this was what long-term relationships looked like after the honeymoon phase. Less passion. More routine, but routine doesn't hide messages. One evening he fell asleep on the couch. His phone rested on his chest, screen lighting up every few minutes. I stared at it from across the room, fighting the urge. I had never checked his phone before. Never felt the need. That night, I did that. My hands shook as I lifted it. He had changed the password, but I knew him. Birthdays mattered to him. I tried his mother's birthday, unlocked. The first thing I saw wasn't explicit. It was intimate. Her name sat at the top of his messages. The conversation wasn't short. It wasn't new. Weeks of daily communication that I scrolled, inside jokes I didn't understand. Complaints about work he never shared with me. Photos of his lunch sent to her. Voice notes. Laughing emojis. And then the lines that felt like knives. I feel like you actually get me. I can't talk like this at home. You make my day better. My vision blurred, but I kept reading. She asked if he was happy. That he replied, it's complicated. Complicated. 5 years reduced to one word. Then I saw it. I wish I met you earlier. There was no confusion left. No room for interpretation. This wasn't casual. This wasn't friendly. This was emotional intimacy redirected somewhere else. That my chest tightened so hard I had to sit down. I could hear him breathing behind me, peaceful and unaware. The man who once told me I was his future was building a parallel connection in secret. That I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't insecure, that I was being replaced slowly. That I put the phone back exactly where it was and didn't sleep that night. I stared at the ceiling and replayed every recent memory. The late nights. The sudden gym obsession. The distance. It all aligned too perfectly. That I in the morning, I confronted him. That I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I asked one simple question. Do you have feelings for her? His face shifted. Not shocked. Not confused. Calculating. What are you talking about? I read the messages. Silence stretched between us like a pulled wire. It's not what you think, he said finally. That I almost laughed. That sentence is universal. It always means exactly what you think. You told her you wish you met her earlier. He ran his hands through his hair. It's just talking. It's not physical. Nothing happened. Just talking. As if emotional betrayal doesn't count. That he said she understood him. That they connected over work stress. That it felt harmless. That he never meant for it to go that far. How far is far? I asked. That he couldn't answer. Instead, he flipped the focus. If you weren't so distant lately, maybe I wouldn't need someone to talk to. There it was. The shift. The blame that I felt anger rise, but underneath it was something worse. Sadness. Not because he chose someone else, but because he justified it. So this is my fault? I didn't say that. You implied it. He sighed like I was exhausting him. Like discovering betrayal was an inconvenience. I'll stop talking to her, he said. If that's what you want. If that's what I want. If basic loyalty was negotiable, that I asked him directly. Do you love her? No, too quick. Do you have feelings for her? A pause. I don't know. That hurt more than a yes. That I should have left right then. Everything inside me knew the foundation had cracked. But 5 years isn't easy to walk away from. Shared memories argue louder than logic. That he promised it was over. Said he would delete her number. Said it meant nothing compared to us. He held my face and told me I was overthinking something small, but it wasn't small that he had already given someone else the parts of him that used to belong to me. That I agreed to try. Not because I believed him completely, but because I wasn't ready to accept that our story might be ending. For a few days, he acted attentive again. More present. More affectionate. Almost like the beginning, but forced effort feels different than natural love, and even when he smiled at me, I couldn't stop wondering who he was thinking about when his phone stayed silent. That I forgave him. At least on the surface, but trust doesn't reset. It fractures, and something inside me knew this wasn't the full truth. That it was only the part one had managed to uncover. The uneasy feeling she had been carrying for days refused to disappear. At first she tried to bury it beneath routine, convincing herself that she was imagining things. But every late night, every guarded glance at his phone, every vague explanation slowly chipped away at the trust that once felt unbreakable. Eventually the doubt became too heavy to ignore. One evening Daniel told her he had another work dinner. The explanation sounded familiar, almost rehearsed. He said a client from out of town needed to be entertained and that he might be home late again. She nodded the same way she always did, pretending to accept the answer without question, but this time she didn't stay home. After he left, she waited 10 minutes before grabbing her keys. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped outside. She didn't fully understand what she expected to find. A part of her still hoped she would discover nothing at all and feel foolish for ever doubting him. She followed his car from a distance through the quiet evening traffic. The city lights reflected across the windshield while her mind kept repeating the same desperate thought. Please let me be wrong. Daniel eventually turned into a street she rarely visited. It was lined with small restaurants and warm glowing lights spilling onto the sidewalk. She watched as he parked and stepped out of the car. For a moment he simply stood there, checking his phone. Then someone approached him. A woman. The way she walked toward him carried a familiarity that immediately made the truth impossible to deny. She smiled the moment she saw him. Not the polite smile of strangers meeting, but the warm expression of someone happy to see the person she had been waiting for. Daniel smiled back. They hugged. It wasn't a quick greeting between acquaintances. It was the kind of embrace that lingered just long enough to say more than words ever could. The world around her suddenly felt very quiet. She remained in her car across the street, unable to look away. The woman slipped her arm through Daniel's as they walked into the restaurant together. Through the wide front window she could see them clearly. Once they sat down, they leaned close to each other while talking. Daniel laughed in a way she hadn't heard in months. At one point he reached across the table and gently took the woman's hand. That small gesture broke something inside her. It was no longer suspicion. It was no longer uncertainty. The truth sat directly in front of her, undeniable and painfully clear. Her husband wasn't working late. He was building a life with someone else. For a long time she stayed in the car watching them. Not because she wanted to torture herself, but because leaving would have meant accepting what she had just seen. As long as she remained there, Some fragile part of her mind still believed this moment might somehow explain itself, but it didn't. They finished dinner slowly, enjoying the evening as if the world contained only the two of them. When they finally stood up to leave, Daniel placed his hand gently on the small of the woman's back as they walked outside. It was a casual gesture, natural and affectionate. A gesture he used to make with his wife. She started the car before they noticed her and drove away quietly, her vision slightly blurred by the tears she had been holding back all night. The drive home felt endless. Questions flooded her thoughts faster than she could process them. How long had this been happening? When had their marriage stopped being enough for him? Had he ever planned to tell her the truth, or had he simply hoped she would never find out? By the time she reached the house, exhaustion had replaced the shock. She sat in the dark living room for nearly an hour before Daniel finally walked through the door. He looked exactly as he always did after a long evening out. Slightly tired, loosening his tie, moving comfortably through the familiar space as if nothing in the world had changed. He greeted her with mild surprise when he noticed she was still awake. She watched him carefully for a moment, studying his face, wondering if she would see even the smallest sign of guilt. There was none. That realization hurt almost more than the betrayal itself. She asked him where he had been. He answered calmly. The same work dinner story he had told earlier returned without hesitation. He described it casually, mentioning colleagues who weren't even there. The lies came too easily. That was when she finally spoke the words she had been holding inside since the restaurant. She told him she had seen him. The change in his expression was immediate. For the first time that night he seemed unsure of what to say. His confidence faded into silence as he searched for another explanation. At first he denied everything. He said she must have misunderstood. He said the woman was only a friend. He insisted that nothing inappropriate had happened, but the longer the conversation continued, the weaker his excuses became. Eventually the truth surfaced piece by piece. The relationship had started months earlier. What began as casual conversations had slowly turned into something deeper. Somewhere along the way he stopped trying to end it, and the most painful part of all was something she learned next. The other woman wasn't a stranger. She was someone they both knew, someone who had been part of their social circle for years, someone who would soon become impossible to avoid, because Daniel had already made a decision about his future. He wasn't planning to fix his marriage. He was planning to leave it.